So I'm going to go ahead and open up our Gerber Daisy file in Photoshop. Right click, open with Photoshop. And what we're going to do is isolate our flower first so that we're able to duplicate it 3 times. After we isolate our flower, we're going to change our background to black and white and desaturate it. And then what is really key, more than anything else, is paying attention to layer order. Now, from your first short assignment, we started talking about layers and layer masks. That is key in being able to do what we're doing in this short assignment here. Everything is going to happen on a layer mask because you can always go back and undo the changes that you're making, unlike the eraser tool where once you erase the pixels, they are gone forever. Okay? So, first thing I'm going to do is actually unlock my background layer. And then I need to duplicate my background layer. Now, duplicating your background layer can be accomplished in a couple of different ways. My favorite way to do it is with this really long convoluted string of hotkeys. There's a really short hotkey called Command J, which will duplicate the layer that you're currently selected on. But this can sometimes do some goofy things. So I always opt to use Command, Option, Shift, N to create a new layer, or Control, Alt, Shift, N if you're on a PC. And then Command, Option, Shift, E, or Control, Option, Shift, Control, Alt, Shift, E if you're on a PC. And a good way to remember that is the N stands for new blank layer. The E stands for copy everything that exists on the canvas into my new layer. Okay? So this is basically grabbing everything that we have existing here and placing it all onto a new layer. So Command Option Shift N, Command Option Shift E. Now that I've got my new layer, we can start using those layer masks and getting rid of our background. But it's going to be really difficult to see what's turning on or turning off with our pixels if I leave my bottom layer, this layer 0, turned on. So to show you what I'm saying, if I add a layer mask by clicking this third icon here, making sure that layer 1 is selected because that's the layer that I want it to go on, I grab a brush from my palette, or hotkey B. I can make my brush smaller using those bracket keys. So I'm going to use the left bracket key to scale down my brush to make it a more manageable size. And then remember, the color of our brush is what determines whether we're turning the pixels on or off. If you're using a white brush, you're turning pixels on. As you can see in our layer mask, currently everything is white, so all the pixels are turned on. Black turns the pixels off. So I can switch my foreground and background color very quickly by using the hotkey X, and you'll notice that it switches. So now that I've got a black brush, if I draw a line of where I'm wanting to turn those pixels off, you'll notice that the line shows up on my layer mask, but it doesn't look like anything turned off on my screen, right? Well, that's because I have that layer 0 still turned on, and it's a duplicate. So of course, as I'm turning those pixels off, it looks like they're still there. But if I turn my layer 0 off, now you can see that line that I drew in my layer mask. Okay? So if you're working on this at home, and you're using your mask, and you're like, why aren't these pixels turning off? Well, chances are you still have your bottom layer turned on. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can go about selecting all of that blue. Photoshop provides us with multiple tools. You could literally go in here and just brush this out all by hand if you want. And to be perfectly honest, I think that's the quickest way. That's probably the way that I would go about doing this. There's a couple other ways. There's the magic wand that's going to start selecting individual pixels. And then because our background is mostly blue, I can also select a color range. And I can tell Photoshop, select everything that's blue, and then all the colors that exist next to that blue. So I'm going to go ahead and show you both. And then I'll show you just masking it out by hand because that's what I prefer to do. So if we were selecting a color range, it's important that you make sure that you move your bracket onto the layer instead of on the layer mask. Because if it's on the layer mask, then it's going to try and select things that exist on the layer mask, and currently there is nothing there. So if I want to work with the pixels that are in the photo, I need to make sure that my active bracket is around the pixels. And then I can go up to Select, and then Color Range. And we get this little menu that shows up. And we can either start sampling colors, or we can start clicking Add and Subtract to start adding a palette of many colors. Okay. So first I'm going to just select my individual eyedropper to just start the selection process. And immediately when I select blue from the canvas over here, you see that it starts turning white in my little heads-up display. So if I want to continue to add to that original selection, I need to have my Add To eyedropper, the one with the little plus symbol on it instead of the minus. And as I continue to click around the canvas, it's going to continue to add the colors that I'm clicking on. So eventually I'm going to work my way around clicking on everything except for my flower. And eventually I should be able to grab pretty much the entire color range except for my image. That flower that I'm trying to avoid grabbing, right? Now the fuzziness slider is going to give us kind of this like expansion of the pixels that are currently selected, and it's really cleaning up the slop more than anything else. So as I turn my fuzziness all the way down, you're going to notice that my pixels are a lot more strict in terms of the selection. It's exact. But as I turn the fuzziness up, even though I was selecting blue, you'll notice that the center of the flower is starting to be selected as well too, and that's because some of those black pixels that exist inside of the seeds are actually containing some blue inside of it as well too. So as I slide that fuzziness slider up to clean up the slop, it's actually picking up some other pixels that I don't want it to grab. So I'm going to find a happy median where my center is not selected, but I don't have a bunch of random pixels laying around the rest of the background there. Once I'm happy with how things look, we can always adjust and make changes, but I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And you'll notice that now I have these dancing ants that are around everything that was blue. So this is really as simple as now moving my bracket, my active bracket, back over to my layer mask, and making sure that I have a black brush, because black is what's going to turn the pixels off. And I can very quickly, because those dancing ants are going to stop my brush from going outside or deviating from that selection, just go through and turn all those pixels off. Now, if we get really close, you're going to notice, look how sloppy my edges are, right? We clearly are going to have to go back in and clean these up a little bit. And you'll also notice that the center of the flower, even though it didn't look like anything was selected, has also been started to be masked out as well too. Now the benefit of working with a layer mask is I can just simply change my foreground color to white by pressing X. And I can just turn these pixels back on really quick. I didn't erase them, I didn't throw them away. I've non-destructively edited that layer, and I can go back and continue to make changes. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete my layer mask and show you another route to get to the same place. Add a new layer mask back. Now I want to activate the pixels instead of my layer mask, so I've moved my bracket over to the pixels. And I can grab my either quick selection tool or the magic wand tool. They work very much the same, but I'm going to show you the quick selection tool because I think it works a little bit more efficiently. The quick selection tool is actually a learning tool in Photoshop. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it learns what pixels you're trying to select based on what you're adding and subtracting. Now you can add and subtract to the selection by simply using the Option key or the Alt key on your PC and the Shift key. The Alt key is going to turn, see how currently there's a little plus sign inside of my cursor? If I hold, if I start to make a selection and I hold down the Option key, you're going to notice that my cursor is going to have a minus sign in the center of it versus a plus sign. And so that's going to tell me that I'm going to subtract out those pixels. Okay. So I want to keep adding, so I'm going to hold down my shift, and I can keep going in, and as long as I don't touch anything that is orange, I'm all right. Now, orange and green are pretty similar in color, and so this quick selection tool has already selected my stem. This is where it starts becoming a learning tool. If I hold that option key down to subtract pixels out, and I start coming in, as long as I don't deviate from my stem, you're going to notice that it starts subtracting before I even get to the bottom of the stem. It grabbed all the rest of those green pixels. It's learning that I'm trying to get rid of that selection that's already been made. Now you'll notice too that it's left my petal in the background back here unselected or selected. So I want to go in and clean that up a little bit more. And before I even get to the end of the petal, it fixes it all the way out. Now you'll notice too that it gets really sloppy down inside of that edge right there. It's pretty hard to get inside of that gap. And so this is where this tool starts to have its downfalls. Okay. So I could make my brush even smaller still and come in here and try and add to. But the moment that I accidentally touch an orange pixel, if I deviate from the blue, it's going to start selecting the flower again. Okay, so you got to have a steady hand to get down inside of that crevice. And then there's also this little splash of blue that exists in between those petals right there. So I'm going to want to add that to my selection as well. So once again, after I've got my dancing ant set and everything that is blue is currently selected, if I move my bracket back over to my layer mask and I use a brush and I make sure that my brush is black with my foreground color, so I'm going to use my hotkey X to move black to my foreground, I can come in and it's going to mask out everything that was selected. And when I press Command D to deselect those dancing ants to get rid of them, when I zoom in, you're going to notice that the edges are still kind of sloppy, but not quite as sloppy as what it was when we were using the color selection tool. So this is why I say it's almost easier to just do it by hand, because eventually you're going to have to do it by hand anyways, right?
Wait, what did you do after you selected?
If you didn't catch what I did, stop following on your computer and watch the video and follow along in the tutorial.
What magnification would be best to do that free hand transform?
Whatever works best for you. You want to zoom in as much as you probably can to be able to see where those pixels exist. So, you know, as I zoom in further and further and further, you're eventually going to get to a point where you start seeing just the grid, literally the grid of pixels, okay?
Right.
And so, you know, it's going to be up to you as to make that determination as to how much zoom you should have.
Okay. Where do you standardly work from? Just zoom in and out, zoom in and out?
Yeah, just in and out as I work my way around.
Okay.
So now, I'm actually going to go in and start cleaning up my edges around these petals, okay? And I'm going to move very quickly. You guys at home should be working a little bit more carefully and making sure that your edges are a lot cleaner. So I'm going to be grading on your attention to detail, okay? Now the beautiful thing here is that layer mask, it's non-destructive, and so I can turn the pixels on and off. So if I make a mistake, I can very easily go back and correct that mistake just by pressing X. So we're going to stay pretty zoomed in, and I'm going to work back and forth. So my left hand is basically always going to hover right over top of the X on my keyboard, and I'm constantly going to be going back and forth between turning pixels on and turning pixels off. So right here, we have this really narrow gap that it didn't pick up. Sometimes these corners are really hard to get. Well, it's always easier if you work from the outside in. So I'm going to turn the pixels off first. And it was a very sloppy turning pixels off, right? But now I can control my edge by turning them back on more precisely and creating that corner that was originally there before my big brush made a big old sloppy gap, right? So I take out and then I paint back. So as I work my way around the flower, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to find my edge. I'm going to soften it up a little bit so it's not so jagged all the way around. The brush that I'm working with, it's only a 7 pixel brush and the hardness is turned all the way down to 0. Remember, if the hardness is at 100%, it's going to be a very strict, rigid edge. But because my hardness is turned down to 0%, it's a very soft, feathered edge. It's got a nice, easy transition. So welcome to the 2nd grade where we just color inside of the lines. We've done this many, many times before in our lives, and here we are now doing it on the pixel scale. So you'll notice that as I'm going around the flower, I found that edge, right? Some of the blue's starting to come back. I just press my hotkey X to swap back over, and now I can start turning those pixels back off again. Find that edge, and then refine it.
So instead of coming in with just a eraser tool and just coming in, taking that out, free transform, rip it out, pull it, turn it off, rather than erasing from inside, coming back out.
Easier.
You got it. Now, you'll notice that as I click here, I'm just to show you, reference, see how the pixels that are being turned off exist outside of the edge of my cursor? I don't know why Photoshop does this, but if you go into Photoshop, Preferences, and then Cursors, you can set the cursor to either be precise, standard, or normal brush tip, or to show the full size brush tip. I always leave this to full size. And that's going to show you all the way to the edge of the feather versus the feather extending outside of the edge of that cursor. So if yours is acting goofy and you just can't figure out why you're not using the cursor but it's still erasing pixels outside of the edge of it, it's probably because your settings inside of Photoshop aren't set to full size brush tip. So now you'll notice that I didn't change the size of my brush, but my cursor is bigger than what it was before. So if I do the same thing and erase some pixels, those pixels aren't going to go outside of my cursor any further. So back to turning off pixels, turning them back on. Cleaning up my edges all the way around the flower. Now, clearly you guys are going to spend much, much more time going in and cleaning up all the way around this flower, making sure that your edges are nice and prim and proper. We're not going to make this video an hour long. So now that I've isolated my flower, if I turn that background layer back on, it's almost like everything's back, isn't it? Well, remember our layer mask is changing whether those pixels are turned on and off. We're going to need to start duplicating our layer. Now, if you use the hotkey that I told you before, and we do Command-Option-Shift-N, Command-Option-Shift-E, and your background layer is turned on, then it's going to duplicate all the pixels from all the layers and put them onto the new one. So no longer do I have a flower that's isolated, I have my flower with my background still. This is where the Command J for your duplicate layer is going to work in your benefit, because it's literally duplicating the layer that you have selected, and it's no longer paying attention to the entire canvas. So even if I leave my background layer turned on, as long as layer 1 is selected, and I press Command J, you're going to notice that it duplicates the layer that was selected, and it also duplicates the layer mask that was on that layer as well too. So now I've got 2 layers of flowers that are isolated with the background already masked out. So if I press Command J again, there we have it. We now have our 3 flowers that you need to Photoshop this file to look like the one that's in the rubric. So thinking back to your short assignment 1, does anyone remember the hotkey for transforming?
Command T.
Command T is your transform, or Control T if you're on a PC. So if I select my layer, that the flower that was on the left and down towards the bottom that was actually over top of the stem, because my topmost layer needs to be over top of everything else, I'm going to make that the layer that's down in that bottom left corner. because layer order is everything. So when I select my layer, press Command T, I get my transform controls. I hold Shift. I start making my movement. I let go of my mouse, and then I let go of Shift, so we do not squish any pixels, right? And I can even turn on the other layers to reference and make sure that I've got my size right. Which actually needs to be just a little bit smaller, right? And then the third flower, the smallest flower that existed in the bottom right corner, was actually below everything else. So then I'm going to grab my very bottom isolated flower, because our layer order, remember, the topmost layer is on top of everything, the bottom layer is below everything. It's like you're looking at a layer cake from the top down. I can select that layer, Command T for my free transform. And now that flower is behind everything else. Press Enter to commit those changes. Now when I turn on my background, we've got our 3 flowers in the proper layer order. The only thing that we have to do is now desaturate our background, right? So if I select my layer 0, whenever I add an adjustment layer, it will always add that adjustment layer just above the layer that is currently selected. So I don't currently see my adjustment panel. Oh, I do. I lied. If you don't see your adjustment panel, if you click on Window and then Adjustments, it will show you your adjustments layer. Okay. What I'm looking for is my black and white adjustment layer. It's the third icon from the left in the second row. When I click on that icon, it adds a black and white layer, and because that black and white layer is below all the isolated flowers, it's not going to affect those flowers. If I click and drag that adjustment layer above everything else, it turns everything below it black and white. But if I move it back down, it only turns our background black and white. Now there's one other trick in terms of locking an adjustment layer to only affect one layer. Even if it was in the middle of all of these layers and I only wanted the black and white to affect layer 0, if I hold down the Option key on my keyboard and then move my cursor just in between the layers, it's going to turn into like a little square with an arrow that points down. When that cursor switches, if you click, it's going to shift that adjustment layer over, and that little arrow that's pointing down now denotes that that adjustment layer is locked to and only affecting layer 0. So once you get everything cleaned up, your flowers isolated, your background black and white, Command-Shift-S to save as, or Control-Shift-S to save as. You're going to name it your name, Shorty2, Gerber, so that I know this is your Gerber Daisy file, and you're going to want to save this as a Photoshop document so that it preserves your layers, and then make sure that it's in your Shorty Assignment 2 folder on Pluto.